everyone. I'm from Belgium. And when I left yesterday, it was we had minus 15 degrees, so it's really warm in here. I don't know if there's any chance to get some fresh air in here. But anyway, I'm very happy to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. I hope it's not just an exchange or a diplomatic exchange, but that we can also learn from each other. And when I was listening to Vanessa's presentation, I was trying to see, the red line or from the sessions this morning, and we said we have the tools and we are going to define how we use them. So we are not following quite a straight path, but we go from the materials to the how, and then we try to make it or to give some sense to our work. And we need context. So in my case, this context is Belgium or the region of Brussels. So my context, a Belgian one, which for this presentation I told myself I'm not going to explain the study thoroughly, but I do have to give you some context. However, if I go deeper in the Belgian case, it's going to take me forever. So in this case, well, the Belgian context with certain elements, not all of them. And if you are interested in that, this information, it's on a website which you can visit. Also, something else. I'm Spanish, born in Belgium. So, well, there were many immigrants who went there, not always remember, in this country. And even though I come from a Spanish background, my Spanish is very informal, very familiar. So I may have some trouble with this great language, which is Spanish. So I also, well, René is going to be here today, so he knows that my English is very exotic, so I would say I speak languages in a very particular and exotic way. So I hope you can understand me. So let's begin. So to give you some background without going deeper into the whole Belgian issues, I would say, first of all, Brussels, it's not, or the other way around. Belgium, it's not Brussels. Everywhere in the world, people are talking about Brussels when referring to Belgium. But the country is much more complex than that, actually. There's a French-speaking part and Netherlands-speaking part. In the second place, the education system depends on the communities, on the regions, and the national government has nothing to do with education, so that's important to mention. So here I'm talking about some research which was carried out in the French-speaking part. There was another team which did the same research in the Flemish part, although the methodology was not exactly the same. The conclusions were very similar. So what are the particularities of the Belgian context? First of all, the educational system depends on the French-speaking and Flemish Ministry of Education, so two different ministries. And well, without knowing very well the Spanish education system, the Belgian one is based on the double pedagogical approach, which makes things more complicated. This means that everyone can, or all families, can choose the school they want, and everyone is able or is allowed to present their own educational project, which seems very good. It sounds very good, but it's complicated. And then we have liberal schools, and then we have Catholic schools. So the state, in 1958, there was a school pact or agreement where the French-speaking part were fighting against the Flemish part, and the result was the pedagogical freedom. But we don't have the same concept of laicity as in France, which consists of everyone having the same values imposed by the Republic of France. But in our system, everyone is allowed to learn in many different ways. Therefore, schools, or in every schools, you have Catholic classes, but also Islam, Protestant, and so on. So if any student requests for a specific religion course, it is provided to them. And then we have moral. So that's the freedom of organizing their own system. So there are 4 main networks in the French-speaking part. The Catholic one, which is the majority, the public one, the provincial or local. Are you familiar with the concept province, right? So provinces and local municipalities, they have the backing of very strong syndicates. So when something of this school agreement it's not done, they really put up a fight, because they really want a good quality education. So if every philosophy had its own school system, it's also the one which creates most unequal populations. We have school ghettos. So we have schools for rich people in one area of the country and the city, and then we have schools for poor people. So segregation is a problem there. Also, this affects the citizenship education. In order to survive as a school, you have to compete against other schools. So we call it in Belgium the school market. The school market is everywhere. In mondialization, it's another financial tool, but since we lack protection in our country, which is not the case in France. So in order to survive a school, you have to get as many students as possible. And also, schools are very clear which students they don't want to have. So every school reaches out for a very specific target group. And you realize that in Belgium you have schools for a majority of white Belgian people, and then schools in Brussels, for instance, where there's a lot of tension and where they have also these schools with the children of bureaucrats and other international organizations. So, and then we have this ghetto neighborhood. The socio-economical index, it's from 1 to 3 in this area. And this is important to see what kind of financial support are they going to receive. So, depending on the social and financial situation of the parents, these schools may have more or less financial support for an alternative education. And then the schools which took part in this study in which I participated myself, we realized that in one area or one neighborhood, the results were very good, but the school right next to it was right the opposite. So our school reproduces inequalities in societies. And going back to your framework, there are certain elements that interact with each other. And we should go back to the context. It's not the same if you go to the Eurocrat school or a school in Molenbeek. So when talking about pedagogical freedom, you should refer to a framework which we call it a decret mission. And I'm not quite sure what's the translation of that. So I just put it there in French. So all school or private, public, independent, and so schools have to adhere to this framework. In the first place, the goal of this tool is to promote self-esteem and development of every student, and also to provide them with knowledge and competencies to find work and to develop their lives. And in the third place, to make them or to prepare them to be responsible citizens, which is able to contribute to development in a democratic, solidary, pluralist, and open to other cultures, or society which is open to other cultures. And finally, to guarantee the same opportunities to everyone. So even though we have this framework, it's difficult to implement. And also the very framework, it's opposing itself, because it has many contradictions, because we ask the students to be there, or to make the students a Dalai Lama, like I'm feeling good, I'm in peace with my environment. And so, of course, I'm joking a bit around this issue, but just for you to see. But at the same time, we ask the teachers to make the students new Bill Gates, to have the job of their lives, to get to be the CEO of multinational companies, and so on. And then, do you know José Bové? So that will be the third profile. We demand teachers to make the students like him, so that they have commitment, that they adhere to movements, that they are solidary, and so on. So I think for teachers it's impossible to accomplish all this at the same time. I guess there are many teachers among us today. But as I was saying, we have a political framework which is asking for contradictions, and also teachers are not prepared for live in this kind of a schizophrenia. So in my class, or these frameworks led to the situation where the teacher in citizenship or global citizen education is going against all the other courses. And if you don't accomplish that, it seems that you are not a good teacher. So we realized, or we carried out a study through the internet, or And some teachers will say, my job consists of, giving information, and that's it. And there are other institutions which should handle everything else. And then we had some answers from teachers saying, okay, we have to educate in different ways and alternatives. So again, there are tensions among schools, among teachers, among systems, among networks. Everything's fine so far? You are awake. That's good.
So all these contradictions need to be integrated. We also had interviews with NGOs, and we realized that they are really not, they don't have a recognition of society. For example, I don't want my son to have points instead of an assessment, a formal assessment. Also, for example, as environmental education, I want him to recycle and do some nice art projects in class. There are some actors that force the school to adopt specific measures. For example, some schools offer economy. I think it's the same here, right? Well, it looks like so. I will refer to the survey afterwards, but right now in Belgium we are in a key moment because there are some discussions that are happening. One of the current debates and discussions are the Charlie Hebdo attacks, but there were also some precedents. There was a strong impact in many countries, but especially in Belgium. And I think there was a before and after related to the stereotypes that we are being assigned unfairly. So there's a debate on whether proposing a citizenship subject. I know you had this class in Spain. It's not being taught anymore, maybe next year. But there was this citizenship class 2 hours a week because it looked like it was a terrible thing to do because religion teachers would lose 2 hours a week. So the idea basically would be the idea that it's being proposed to have 1 hour a week for religion philosophy for the different religions of the world, and then another hour a week for education on values, basically. Then, what happened in Belgium is that the education minister offered something interesting, but she had everyone against her, for example. But it looks like this is what she wants to do, having these 2 hours. And the attacks opened the parents' mind, and they realized that maybe it would be important that even if students have different religions, they learn together about the essence of the religions and about the whole set of religions of the world. So we have solidarity, economy, solidarity. We have different aspects, and they gather together to make a proposal to analyze and do part of the citizenry subject. They said it was a cross-sectional process, but that it could be interesting to participate in the construction of the course. The minister also launched an excellence pact. I hate the word personally, but the idea behind is that for 2 years, all the school agents and civil society reflect upon an alternative system. For 8 months, there have been work groups with different entities, with the NGOs, with the unions. So they're having this excellence pact. On paper, this looks very nice, and people think that they will basically reach the same point with different words. But some things are not going to change. We would have to break the ghetto schools. They say it's going to get out of the budget. But I see there's no willingness to change, really, the budget. But there is willingness to get more ideas. However, there's not many positive hopes on this. I looked up in the dictionary this word, and it said it didn't exist. I'm not sure if it's a word. Yeah, de-radicalization. So basically, there's this process that were offered in schools to detect some students that maybe would have some hard purposes, so to say. Who would teach these courses? Some official ministries, NGOs. They wanted courses for newcomers who come as refugees, for example. But for some weeks, you know that we have a nationalist, right-wing government, almost extreme right-wing, and they said that these courses would not be useful, and they just wanted to kick everyone out of the country, and whoever had Belgian nationality, they wanted to take the Belgian nationality. So at the pedagogical level, it's hard to get into these topics, but it is urgent. How we explain many things. Well, let's move on to this one. Development education. I'm not talking about the study yet. We have an institutional framework. We've had it for 30 years that has evolved. There is a very fluid dialogue between NGOs and the Belgian government. And I'm going to stop here on this. But the government actually wants to assess and value their cooperation. That's how it started. Then the NGOs created some dialogue, and they said, well, we are going to defend our philosophies, and then the government defends their own. But they respect each other. So for 10 years, we see the resource management evolved. And then also we'll talk about global citizenship education, depending on the ideology behind. But this is also tending to unification. We have resources, and all the values were done in a network. So there's some institutionalized work that have a common framework. And until this study was done, there was not really any formal dialogue with the education ministry, because as you know, it is complicated to do some reflection work at an institutional level in Belgium. We have 5 education ministers. The one I was mentioning before was primary school minister, and we have 5. So right now there's a group working with actors from NGOs, from the government, and they are working on it. Then we have one specificity. This is very interesting. Our own government has their own development education program. It's a philosophical and pedagogical actor, and we think it's very positive. Of course, this is the institution that receives more grants and help. It's called Annoncer les couleurs, Announce the Color, and it's a federal institution. There's some French-speaking part and Flemish part also. It's managed by the Belgium agency. And in a previous session that we had with the Education Ministry in Belgium, they decided to carry on a study. And for 18 years, they have been working to support the integration of citizenship global education at schools. The direct action comes from the NGOs, but this Annoncer les couleurs tried to influence in the initial training, in permanent training, also in unions and networks. And they try to offer tools to the NGOs and people working at schools. So after 18 years of work, they were wondering that if activities were just too narrow, there was not a wider political reflection, and they wondered why schools didn't work at a cross-sectional level, and also that there should be some work at a higher level. So they asked us to carry out a study about how teachers perceived citizenry education. So we asked teachers what they thought under this term, and also we asked what practices they used, either with NGOs or not. For us, it was not important that it was with NGOs, but we wanted to know what the main actors at the schools thought, and we wanted to know what difficulties they had, but also what perceptions they had at the pedagogical and educational level. Because after 20 years, we didn't really know what was going on inside the school. So we got very interesting answers, and we basically relativized the role of the NGOs at the school. I have, 20 minutes. So good so far? Well, the purpose and the goals of the study, what we know is that there are many resources for citizenship education, and 60% go to the schools. We saw that in Belgium, as if the school was the best place for social change. That's a hypothesis that we could verify. And we see that everyone puts all the resources at the school, not in other groups, for example, women groups. That's what we had. So the purpose was to define the strategies from Annoncer les couleurs and some NGOs. after this study, and then we also wanted to listen what the main actors in the scene wanted to say. The research team had to adapt to the goal of the study. So we didn't want people sitting in an office with researchers that didn't really have a grasp of what was going on in the school. We had a joint group of researchers with people coming from different backgrounds, including myself, who has a background on education and NGOs. But we also had research professors, we had pedagogues, and people from social pedagogical movements. So we had different backgrounds. And that allowed us as a team to look at each other and construct an analysis framework that integrated different dimensions and perspectives from a conceptual and theoretical point of view. I'm not going to deepen on the aspects of the study, but there are some analysis elements that will define our analysis framework. That framework was imagined before the study, and we redefined it during all the study. We worked with 25 schools at different levels. So we had management on one side and then the students from the last year of secondary school. And not including the teachers. So we picked different schools from different areas with different social economical indexes from 1 to 20, from the 4 networks, Catholic and so on, and the others. We had direct contact, direct meetings with the people in the schools. And we also had interviews with all the stakeholders in the school. We had academic counselors, academic inspectors, the minister, the administration, also the unions. And when we talked with the unions, we realized how they influenced other stakeholders. One recommendation we gave was that unions worked with NGOs and teachers because they never do.
So I would like to share with you some elements of the analysis. So we built that for the practices of teachers, but then we realized that it would be useful for NGOs as well. And when we talk about global citizenship education at schools, it depends on the educational function of the different actors. So the arrows represent tensions. It doesn't mean this is good or this is bad. They are just tensions. So there are tensions on the one part and on the other part. And then we realize that one group of the actors are more on the left side. So they conceive their jobs as being an instructor, being a transmitter, because if they don't instruct or transmit, students don't have the tools to become a citizen. So nowadays there's such fragility among teachers because they have these newcomers immigrants. And what is citizenship? It's not just a language question, it's a conceptual question. So they think instruction, transmission, and also respect. And they think, okay, my teaching framework is the French one, so I stick to that. And I'm not saying that citizenship education is a bad choice, but that's just not my thing. So they think, okay, my job is being a teacher, a director, and so on. And on the other hand, we have teachers who think that the main goal is to educate, to emancipate, to be transgressive, to break the rules. Because, we have these teaching programs. And these kind of people say, you can accommodate programs. That's not pedagogic. That's not didactic. So, on the other hand, you have people who say, okay, I've never had trouble with teaching inspectors, right, with my emancipation project. So as NGOs, we integrate this proposal, but the NGOs are also involved in that. And this produces a clash between the school and the other actors. Well, some stuff which cannot be mentioned very often in schools, which is political implications. Many teachers, I guess that it's the same situation in Spain. Schooling or education is neutral. But when I talk about mondialization, for instance, I have to talk about politics and political concepts. So some people say it's neutral. Some other people say being a teacher, it's about compromising and committing and saying I cannot do my job if I don't take part in things. So do you remember this decree I was talking about before? It's about neutrality, but this neutrality doesn't mean it has to be active and passive, because passive neutrality means that you don't take any actions and so on. So we refer to the decree, and of course this political implication causes some tensions. And some people might say, my duty is to help these people integrate in this neighborhood. Why should I talk about international stuff and so on when my students have problems at home in the area they are living, right? So they are people who are more focalized, and then some other people who have a wider approach and say we should talk about the world, about global issues. And therefore, many teachers define their programs and their courses depending on the neighborhood and the specificities of the area they are working in. And in some cases, it's possible to establish some partnerships with the town hall to work in regards to citizenship, and in other cases that we work with NGOs to work more altruistic concepts and so on. So, this balance about freedom and education and individuality, and equality. So equality, it's justice, right? And then freedom. You could say, why should we talk about that in class? They've got their parents, they've got other people in their milieu, so it's not my job to teach them that, right? So here you could add many values, such as, lay values or versus religious and so on. So you have a positioning, and education educational positioning, which is a personal choice. And some teachers are working at school and they don't share the principles of that school. And some teachers may work at a neutral Catholic school or conservative school. I'm just making up an example, right? And some other teachers who don't feel right in such an environment. So again, this causes tensions. So this is going to have an influence on the tools, the pedagogical tools that I'm going to use. Am I going to promote the individual level or the collective side of my students, as you were saying before? Or am I going to try my students to understand the contents at their own pace? Or am I going to speed up to give as much contents as possible? And do I understand that all students have the right to learn at their own pace? So in our research, we classified, or we defined the schools have to transmit and emancipate, but very quickly, or they forget about the counterpart. So these verbs, transmit and emancipate, come very often, but also quite often you forget about emancipation. So this transmission and it should be considered as a way through the emancipation, and avoiding giving some contents which have no meaning for students. So I still got 10 minutes left. So besides the definitions on education and the vision of North-South, I would talk about the school context and say that school nowadays has become a commercial tool, and this is not good. So imposing this APC or APD projects, it's difficult. I've seen that more, richer schools have more resources and therefore have more ongoing collaborations with southern nations. They send people over there. So, of course, I'm not saying that all schools work like that. There are super well-balanced schools where it's good and fantastic, but just giving you some examples. So there are some schools who are focusing on transmission of contents, but for them it's the image, the reputation. It's very important. The elite schools focus very deeply on the image and the reputation they have. So they have projects on development, education, or solidarity with the South. This school may have these projects, but they are not making any difference in the southern nations they are helping. They just, go on the trip, but the education institution doesn't give any context, doesn't explain any backgrounds of this country. So they just make, young people help in other nations when these people are not, making their own bed at home. So for the last 10 minutes, I would like to provide you some political and economic context, and also citizenship education. It's fundamental for teachers. But the global or world concept was, very diffuse for them. So they didn't know the difference between global and international. So we realized very quickly that in the context we are living in Belgium, we should learn to say thank you or hello. You know, civic communication, which of course in some schools may be important, but that's just my opinion. But you know, it's not enough. Citizenship, it's activated through action, not it's not learned at school in a class. So there was a lot of work to do in civic education. So in Belgium, these participative committees are compulsory. Students are obligated to be part of one of these committees. But since they don't quite understand what this is all about, they go to the committee and they ask, okay, for one more window in the classroom, but they don't get the essence of it, right? So how can we, link this gap through the global education concept? So should we go directly for global local relationship? Well, it turns out that in the end you forget the local level and you just focus on international conflicts and issues. So first of all, we made the difference between learning to think, so to reproduce the system, and to learn what you have to think, the militant education, which shouldn't be negative, or more negative than the neutral one. And also, in the first place, or under learning to think, learning to participate in public debate and learning to act in a democratic space. Moreover, we define an axe of analysis of the ACM practices. I mean, it's not a game. So that's activism. We can, transmit many concepts, but in an active way. In these practices, we try to analyze, and I think that's a tool that may come handy for you. We try to see where should we put the students' participation. So on the left side, we will have the dismissal. So students are there, but they are not willing to engage. And we moved even beyond, or we went beyond the active concept, because it's not the same to be active than to be the author of the project. So we included the concept of actor, meaning that I'm the one who's making the decision to be part of this, and author. So I've only got 5 minutes left, so I have to keep myself short. I guess it's the same situation here in Spain. So as you can see, we got only few actors and authors. Then we had the cognitive scope of the action. To which extent the information become competencies. And even though nowadays we're so much talking about competencies, NGOs were kind of reluctant to approach these topics. And it was difficult to make them understand that there were other competencies that they could use. And in the second place, or the social affective competences. So can we go from, pitying the poor people in Africa to really taking action in hand? Everything is interrelated and it's linked. and also the acts of institutional deepness or depth. There's Ardoino, he's a referent for French psychologists, and for me it's a guru. So he analyzes social realities in its multiple approaches, and when working in class or collaborating with others, so what's the depth of the institution? So from organizative to historicity, there's not much to say. So I would say my reference for this until historicity is Turan. And he said that historicity, it's the ability of a society to create its own development. And this is translated into social movements. You know, social movements take action. So he's a kind of sociology of the actor, focusing on the actor. And here you can see how schools generate another narrative, another dialogue. So they, NGOs don't try to influence on schools that much, but there are so many other institutions that really do. How can we work to have an influence on schools, not being in the activism side? And secondly, how do we support the educational system, being in a context where we live as NGOs and citizens?
Okay, and I'm reaching the end. I won't really deepen on the result explanation, but after we did all these things, I will show you this chart, this. Okay, it's a little bit complicated to explain, okay? But basically, we tried to see what framework or what strategy would be useful for the school stakeholders and the NGOs in order to change the system from the interior of the system, but considering what reality is. So how all the pedagogical, political, and educational insights would be taken into account being different. So the colors here basically is like a traffic light, okay? The idea is that we start from the bottom and we move up to the top. So in a school, for example, what kind of attitude does the school have? So we have schools that are mobilized over other things that do not really pay attention to global citizenship. Then we have people infiltrated, some teachers. Then we have different groups up to mobilized. How can we support each level so we can move one up? Well, the NGOs should perform activities that allow us to move forward on this regard. The second column would be the devices, so to speak, the journey we need to take to change things, which is still not in operation. Maybe procedure we could talk. So we see how it goes from suitability device. It's okay if we did this, but I'm not going to. We need to move up from there to political consciousness. And then regarding practices, we need to see how we move from adherence to white emancipation without forgetting collaborations, the counterparts, the NGOs, for example. Because Belgian schools didn't really talk about external cooperation. They are not used to work with outer agents. The schools don't really know what options they have. There's not really a cooperation culture in Belgian schools. And if there was, how would we go from material interests commitments to a mutual commitment? That is, we can work together to achieve something. I'm not sure if the idea is clear. But that's it.